lead IST for our men's national team, still involved with our women's national team, as well as working with other athletic associations. I've been involved with the sport of gymnastics, I guess it's close to 7 years now. I had no experience to gymnastics at all before I got involved. I've been in the health field for 20 years, and the first half of that I worked as a strength coach, and most of that was with hockey and football players. And when I transitioned into as a therapist, most of the work I did was with hockey players. So I didn't have a lot of experience with gymnastics, but when I did get involved, especially when I got involved with at the national level, I was really keen on providing things that I thought would make an impact and difference in the sport. And so there's two main things, and one of them will actually be the topic of discussion that I'll be doing next week, as it pertains to conditioning and preparing athletes for gymnastics required skills and demands. And the other one was this topic, how to help in trying to manage loads on the athletes to prevent injuries as best as possible. I should actually change that. We can't really prevent injury. Once you're an athlete in any sport, you're going to get injured. It's just par for doing some athletic endeavor that's going to require your body to do something that's extreme in any sport. So what I should really be saying is managing load to mitigate the occurrence of injuries and improving performance. And so I'm going to try to figure out how to skip slides because I don't know yet. Bear with me one moment. Oh, there we go. Okay. Of course, here in Toronto, we're very familiar with the term load management. All last year, when we had Kawhi Leonard as one of the basketball players on the Toronto Raptors, this was everything you saw in the news. Every topic was about load management to prevent and take care of Kawhi Leonard's body so that he doesn't, that he transitions back from his injuries the last couple years before that, and that he can perform when they needed him most in the playoffs. And of course, because he succeeded, it's carried a lot more weight in the professional sports world and throughout the sports world. It's interesting because in the year 2000, when you did a literature review, you would come across just 9 papers that talked about loading of an athlete and injury/performance. So there wasn't a lot of research being done in the past. Tim Gabbett out of the UK, he's been one of the primary individuals to provide a lot of research and evidence for how to best manage the loading on athletes for optimal performance and for mitigation of injuries. So there's two things when it comes to managing load that we need to understand, and they present the same way, but they develop and operate differently in terms of what leads to them, and that is peripheral fatigue and central fatigue. So most of us will recognize and understand what peripheral fatigue is, and there's a direct relationship of peripheral fatigue to the physical load that we're putting on the body and the physical capacity that the body's having to execute. So for example, if you're doing 10 squats, by the 10th time you're jumping, you may not jump as high. And a big reason for that is because there's fatigue, the elements of fatigue that happens peripherally in the tissues that are being utilized. There's another aspect of fatigue, and that is central fatigue. And that is being spoken about a little bit more when it comes to sports performance nowadays. And the reason why for a long time we didn't talk too much about it is because it's just kind of hard to grasp. There's a lot of intangible markers, and we didn't have proficient ways to measure when someone has central fatigue. And it's not directly related to physical load, although physical load does affect it. So I'll talk about the things that contribute to central fatigue in a moment, but most of our talk initially will be about peripheral fatigue. So if you're wondering what leads to an injury, it's a very simple formula. If anybody ever makes it more complicated, what they're doing is making it complicated, because it's very simple. If the load is greater than the physical capacity that an individual has, you will get an injury. And intuitively that makes sense. And usually when things intuitively make sense, they're accurate. If you have never done, if all you do is a 100-pound squat and one day someone says, okay, let's do a 300-pound squat, you will get injured. You're doing a load greater than the body's capacity, greater than the body's ability to handle. And so you'll get injured. Conversely, if you're a gymnast and you don't have a great range of motion, let's say in your shoulder girdle, to move in a certain position, if you're then asked to do a skill that has you or needs you to get into that position, your capacity is much less than the load that's being demanded of you, and you will get injured. So it's a very simple formula. What makes it tricky is load is not just physical. Load, it can be mental, emotional. There's a psychological component to load. So there's other things that contribute to how someone's experience of load. The easy part is measuring the loads as it pertains to physical demands. That's the easy part. And I'm going to leave you with some markers for you to keep in mind when you're incorporating training programs, so that you know physically when you're giving the appropriate dosage of loading. But it's also important to understand there's other loads that impact an individual. Obviously, this kind of a talk would be so much more pertinent if we were in season and training and conditioning, because we'll be having to deal with it in real time. Right now, we're having the opposite effect, which is most gymnasts are not actually loading their body sufficiently. And that does have an adverse effect as well. If you don't load your body sufficiently, your capacity is going to drop. So this is kind of important information to have once gymnasts are going back and returning to activity. Because if coming from a period of time where there's some deconditioning, if we put loads on them a little bit too quickly, then we're almost bound to have limitations in performance and for sure injury. So ultimately the goal should be, let's increase capacity. And there's different ways you can increase capacity. You can increase capacity of a tissue to handle more. So going back to the squat analogy, if I want someone to increase their capacity to squat, I'm going to get them to squat until they're doing more than 100 pounds. That's them increasing their capacity. There's another aspect of capacity, and going back to that other example of if someone could only raise their arm to this position or only has this range of motion in their shoulder, well then another way to improve capacity is get them strong enough or improve this range of motion so they can go through a bigger range. That's also increasing capacity. And we'll discuss that on the webinar that I'm going to do next week. But the other thing we need to do is also manage loads. Someone's capacity is going to develop, and it's going to develop over time. We can't rush someone's capacity in their bodies to handle physical work. That's physiologically, you can't rush it. It needs time. So what we do need to be really cognizant of is how do we then manage loads so someone adapts without injury. So let's define load as two distinct things. External load, so that's something that's measurable. That's something that they do. That's like 10 sprints, wind sprints. That's 10 squats. That's a measurable load you're giving to someone. That's 10 vaults. That is 10 press to handstands. That's an external load you're giving someone. You're giving them something for their bodies to do that you can measure. The other aspect of load is internal load. And this is similar to when the internal load is what ultimately affects someone's development of central fatigue, which we'll talk about. So internal loads is an individual's physiological and psychological responses to the external load. So you can give Jim and Jack the same 10 squats to do, or 10 leaps to do, or 10 giants to do on bars. Their internal load or their physiological and psychological responses to that load can differ. And there's things that contribute to that differences that we'll talk about. So let's look at just external loads. The higher the loads, typically the frame of reference for most people is, yeah, if you give someone higher loads, then their risk of injury increases. So I've noticed that in gymnastics, there's been in some clubs or among some gymnasts, a transition to try to minimize the loads that we're given to athletes because of a worry or concern that an injury will happen. Well, if you actually look at the literature, the greater the training volume and the higher training intensities, the better performance improves. So it's very difficult then, if we want performance to include, to reduce training volume and training intensities, because they are the precursors to improving performance. However, the concern about the higher loads leading to injury is not unwarranted, because there is also higher incidences of injury occurring when training loads are at their highest. If you look at, and most of the research, by the way, is not done in the sport of gymnastics, unfortunately. So most of the things I reference is other sports. At the last World Championships, we've come together with the various different ISD leads of the various different countries to try to start to do some research that's specific of the sport of gymnastics, but currently there isn't. So I'm referencing other sports, but the human body is the human body. A lot of this can be transferable to the sport of gymnastics. So when in research, when they looked at rugby players, and they noticed that the higher they did speed training and the more sessions of high intensity speed training they did, the more likelihood they sustained soft tissue injuries. So in their efforts to improve performance, they also were increasing the risk of injury. Same thing was the case with youth baseball pitchers. There was almost a 3.5 times, which is a pretty big, 3.5 times greater risk of injury when youth baseball pitchers were pitching more than 100 pitches per outing than less than 100 pitches. And we've already noticed in the sport of baseball, there's been a transition away or a transition towards counting the number of pitches that people throw as a way to manage or modulate their external load. So although we want high training intensities and high training volumes, we also have to understand that there is a risk of injury. So it's not that we need to eliminate high intensities of training and high volumes of training. We just need to understand how best to give it. When do we need to give these dosages of high intensity and high training volumes? Because an individual can be more receptive to those training volumes than other times. So this is a hormetic model of trainings, hormesis is essentially how much poison can you give to something before it dies. Too little poison, the individual doesn't adapt. So if we're talking about cells, if you give some poison to a cell, if you give nothing, the cell never adapts to be able to handle poison. If you give it too much poison, the cell dies. So there's a fine window of poison you can give to a cell for the cell to adapt and to be able to then be resilient to that poison. And that's a sweet spot. And so this graph is trying to show that there is a sweet spot of how much you can actually do high intensity, high volume training and have it be sufficient so that there is adaptation in a positive way. The gymnast gets stronger, the gymnast improves their performance, and at a very low risk of injury. And although this curve is quite, a pretty big curve, the optimal setting is quite narrow in many regards. So there is a real trick in artistry to be able to give an individual an appropriate loading so that they adapt optimally, and not get injured. So Tim Gabbett, in a way to try to figure out what is the appropriate acute to workload ratio. Actually, before I talk about Tim Gabbett, I'll just mention this article that came out in the 50s. And they stated that for performance, the athlete, I'm just going to read what it says, the performance of an athlete in response to training can be estimated from the difference between negative function and positive function. So performance can be indicative based on how much we can minimize fatigue and maximize fitness, which is going back essentially to this graph. How much intensity can we give without too much fatigue and training as a poison? And enough training so that there is positive adaptation or increase in fitness. Fitness is a term that they use in the UK and Europe as a way to when they're referencing strength capacity or physical capacity. So Tim Gabbett, some many years later in the early 2000s, came up with this thing called the acute to chronic workload ratio. And what they were doing in this was trying to calculate essentially the fatigue to fitness ratio to know what is appropriate. How much can we give so that there isn't too much fatigue and failure, and there is enough for fitness or increased performance. So acute load is anything that you give an individual in the short term. So that could look like, if I'm comparing today's workout to what I've done this whole week, if I've done 10 squats today, or in this example, 10 split leaps today, that's my acute training. If I'm comparing this week's worth of training to the last month, if I've done 10 split leaps every training this whole week, that makes up my acute load. The chronic load is the long-term loading and the average loading over time. So in a very general example, let's say I work out and I squat, and I generally squat 100 pounds, 3 sets of 10. That's my general workout for the last 4 or 5 weeks. That would be my chronic load. If I go into the gym one day and all of a sudden decide, you know what, I'm feeling strong today, I'm going to do 140 pounds, 3 sets of 10. That's my acute load. So my acute load becomes what I do in that instant compared to what I've generally on average done. In the sport of gymnastics, you can break it down to a specific skill and say they've executed this skill on average in a given week 5 times. This week, they're being asked to do it 10 times. So based on those numbers, the acute to chronic workload ratio in this case would be 2. Because there was 10 leaps done acutely during a single training, or in this case, a week's worth of training, and there is on average 5 leaps that are done, let's say, over the last 4 weeks of training. So that gives us an acute to workload ratio 2. Now that number doesn't mean anything unless we actually look at the outcome of having a number like that. So Tim Gabbett did that. And what he found in his research was if someone had an acute to chronic workload ratio of less than 0.8, so in the previous example, 10 leaps compared to 5 leaps on average, that gives us a acute to workload ratio of above 2. 0.8 would be if they normally do 5, and now today I've only given them 4 to do. He found that when the acute to chronic workload ratio was less than, around 0.8 or less than, you're at the risk of undertraining. And undertraining also exposes someone to injury, and for sure exposes them to underperforming. On the flip side, what he found that anything around 1.5 or above, you're at risk of exposing someone to injury and exposing someone to the eventuality of central fatigue and peripheral fatigue. They can be fatiguing, so the performance drops because their muscles aren't recovering as much. And also, if you give a high workload for an extended period of time above and beyond what someone can handle, central fatigue, which happens in the central nervous system, leads to the central nervous system not being apt at being able to do what you want your muscles to do. Now, I just want to preface and say that risk doesn't equal rate. So just because there's an increased risk, it doesn't mean you're going to have an increased rate of injuries. There is person-dependent and individual-dependent variations in this. The key thing in this is he found in general in his research done across 3 different sports predominantly, and this is in the UK, so most of them were like rugby and soccer. He found anywhere between 0.8 to 1.3 is generally a good ratio that allows for optimal performance increases and minimization or mitigation of the potential of risk. What does that translate to, let's say in this example of us doing a split leap 5 times on average? It means maybe this week, if you want to increase their demands on them or increase their loads, you get them to do 6. When I first got involved with the sport of gymnastics and the clubs that I would go to what I consistently saw was a really rapid spike or jump in the loading that was given to an athlete. So for example, you are training normal, you're normal for 4 months, for 3 months, they trained and did X number, let's say 10 times of a particular skill. And the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to a competition, there was a desire to obviously develop some proficiency in that execution of that skill. So the numbers increased. And as the numbers increased, you had a really sharp jump, a really sharp spike in the acute to chronic workload. So someone who did that skill 10 times on average, over the course of 2, 3 months, maybe even a month, all of a sudden in a 1 to 2 to 3 week period, they were asked to do it 15 times, 20 times. Or sometimes you're not going to get off the beam until you do it perfectly, which means sometimes they did it 15 times instead of 2 or 3. These spikes are one of the biggest contributors to injuries, which makes sense intuitively, but also performance, because these spikes contribute to central fatigue. So the idea the idea is then when you're planning out a training for the course of a year or even a short period for a month, you want to try to plan it out so that the plan is that you're never really creating a spike big enough above this range of 0.8 to 1.3. Obviously, if someone is injured and recovering and coming back from an injury, these things can sort of put a wrinkle in things, but this is what he found. He found this ratio is ideal to manage the external load that's put on an individual so as to minimize for injuries and maximize for performance. Now, I said that in that those ratios are typically on average what's suggested, and although greater than 1.5 is you're increasing the risk, it doesn't necessarily increase equal to rate. And the reason it doesn't always equal to rate is because there's moderators of how much an individual could handle a spike in workload. And some of those moderators I just listed up there. So I'll start with aerobic capacity. Gymnastics is not a sport that we relate to like an individual needs aerobic capacity. We think of it as an anaerobic sport, and it is predominantly. But if an individual has a large degree of aerobic capacity, and aerobic capacity is what people would consider a really boring cardio run where you're keeping a gentle pace throughout the whole run. That generally is what leads to buildup of aerobic capacity. But if you have a really high aerobic capacity, then your body is really proficient at getting oxygen to everything, including the tissues, so they can recover much quicker. I used to work with a lot of ultramarathon runners, and their bodies were a mess, but the rate of injuries in some of them was actually quite low. And it was purely because their aerobic capacity was so high, their ability to recover and deal with the stressors that they were putting on their body, which is running a marathon almost every week, their body was able to tolerate it. So what he found in his research is that these moderators, like aerobic capacity, minimize the risk of injury whenever the acute to workload ratio spikes, or whenever there's an aggressive increase in intensity or volume of training. The greater someone's speed or strength is in general, in gymnastics, we do some strengthening exercises in the conditioning programs. But if you look at an athlete like Ellie Black, Ellie works with a strength coach. She goes and does deadlifts, she does squats, she does lunges. These things help to build her strength, and in doing so, it improves her ability to handle what she's doing in gymnastics. I just want to say one thing. If you guys have questions as I'm going along, and I don't know how to access the private chat really well, so maybe just you can interrupt me, or Leanne, I'm not sure if you said to them they can ask questions afterwards, but I just saw something light up on the private chat, and I don't know how to get to it without fiddling around for a bit. So
the only thing I see right now is my comment in the chat, unless they sent something to you directly. If you guys could please make sure that you're typing in the chat function and say to everyone, and then that way everybody can see the questions that are coming in so we don't have duplicates, and then we can bring them up at that point. So hopefully that works.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So maybe whoever asked that, oh, now see, I tried to go in the chat and I ruined it. Sorry guys, give me 1 second while now I try to get out of this. I have this thing in front of me now that I don't know how to get out of. Okay, one moment. I'm sorry guys. Oh. Sorry guys, give me one moment. I'm going to, oh, there we go. Okay, I'm back. All right, perfect. So I'm whoever had that question that I wasn't able to get to, I'm sorry. Just remember it and bring it up at the end. Okay, so back to this guy. So there are things, the age of an individual, older athletes in general are not as tolerable to certain loading as younger athletes are. The type of collagen we have in our tissues, the resiliency we have in our tissues are much higher from someone who is 10 years old than someone who is 24 years old. So that affects the spiking in training. Someone's general fitness in the sport of gymnastics, flexibility obviously matters. So the more flexible, especially the active flexibility, the more likely they're able to tolerate greater spikes. And the last thing is previous injury. If someone has a previous injury or multiple injuries, their body's ability to tolerate spikes is going to be deficient, is going to be less, because their body, as a result of that injury, their body never, it's not like when you get an injury and you recover from an injury, you're 100%. You know, there's no going back to the Garden of Eden. Once you're injured, there's some capacity that's lost in the body. And a really good therapeutic approach to dealing with someone is you would try to give as much functioning back in the area of injury and then increase functioning surrounding the injury so they can continue and tolerate more things. But in some cases, that therapeutic or that rehab is never done well or done at all. So previous injury can also limit that, how much you can spike injury, training volumes and intensities.
Mahmoud, we do have a question
Yes.
from Janice.
Yeah.
With the risk for acute injury example, they are asked to do a higher volume of a skill while carrying fatigue, or is it related to soft tissue damage or use injury? It's in the chat if you need to reread. Okay,
I'm trying to understand that question. So do you mind repeating it, because I'm afraid to open the chat and mess it up again.
Sounds good. With the risk for acute injury example, they are asked to do a higher volume of a skill while carrying fatigue, question mark.
Yeah.
Or is it related to soft tissue damage or overuse injury?
Okay, both of those. So in the case of this acute to chronic workload ratio and what typically leads to increased injury, if they're being asked, so the fatigue part, doing a skill when they're already fatigued, I'll talk about it when we're talking about internal loads in a moment. But if we're talking about it in relationship to them getting a soft tissue injury or recovering from a soft tissue injury, if what they're being demanded of today is more than on average what they're asked to deal with, the rate or potential risk of injury increases, especially if it's greater than that that ratio that Tim Gabbett came up with. However, there are some athletes that can handle spikes. I mean, you've done it coaching your athletes. Your athletes have done it, so you can handle spikes. But what impacts how much of a spike you can handle for each particular athlete is based on all these other moderators that I was talking about in this slide. So if someone has had a previous injury, their body can be less able to handle a spike. And maybe one spike it can handle, maybe two spikes it can handle, but if it continues and they're having spikes quite regularly, then you're running the risk of it, the body not being able to handle it. And it doesn't always lead to a breakdown in the form of an injury. It could lead to performance losses, meaning they're just not able to execute a skill as well, or they're not able to go through their routine as cleanly as they did before. Or they've lost some degree of strength or power output, so they can't do their tumbling lines as powerfully as they did before. So I hope that answered the question, Janice. If it didn't, please ask again so I can. So I'll move on to the fatigue part, because that's an important thing, because now we start to have to deal with internal loads. So the internal factors that we need to be cognizant of is a system. So an athlete, their body is a system. A system is how much that system can handle is based on how well that system is running. So if they have current health issues and or strength deficits or weaknesses, then they're not going to be as apt to be able to handle greater spikes of training volume and intensities. Their body can break down and performance will suffer. If in general their nutrition isn't really great, the fuel that their muscles need are deficient, so they're not going to be able to handle the same sort of spiking and acute training occasions. Stress is a big thing. Stress ties into this, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about central fatigue. And it encompasses a lot of different things. And the next bullet point, mental strength and capacity, that's tied into stress. If an individual is stressed about doing a particular skill, let's say, or stressed about an upcoming competition, the degree to which they can deal with stress dictates how much they can physically perform with their body. So some stress is good stress. Stress is not a bad thing. Stress allows for adaptation. But if the stress and how the individual interprets their situation, their stressful situation, is too high, the central nervous system, it affects the central nervous system's functioning. So it affects cellularly what kind of things that are being released, which I won't get into, which then has an effect on power output and stamina within muscles and strength within muscles. So these are some of the internal factors that we need to be cognizant of. Yes, maybe that day we really want our athlete to be able to execute a skill cleanly, so that we as a coach and them as an athlete can feel confident going into the competition that's in 2 weeks. But if that's coming at the risk of them doing 10 to 12 to 13 to 15 additional turns of that skill, and on top of that, you can see their anxiety, their stress levels increasing to an intolerable level, that's not optimal for the body. You're not going to get a good return on your investment. The body will not execute what you want them to do as much as the athlete wants themselves to do it, because what the body's ability, the stress level, and how that affects the nervous system will drop performance output. So here's some key internal loads that we're going to talk about. If you're dealing with female gymnastics, you have to be cognizant of when they begin menses. There's been lots of research that has indicated that there is a potential for weakening of connective tissue and its ability to handle load during periods of ovulation. And in fact, there's a really high preponderance of ACL tears amongst young athletes, young female athletes who are during the period of ovulation. I have, in the last 3 years, have had 3 different athletes, 2 of which were gymnasts, both of which have been on or at what point on the national team that had an ACL tear that correlated with their period of ovulation. So what that means is if we know the body is less able to handle loads during this week to 2 week period, it may not be a good time to really ramp up loading that we're giving them and have that acute to workload ratio be really spiked. We want to generally in this time frame keep it along what the average of what they've been handling all along. Even though they got a competition in 2 weeks and we want them to perform, the risk outweighs the reward in pushing that load to be higher. So this is one of those internal loads to be cognizant of. The growing phase is another one. young adolescent athletes are more at risk of getting growth-related injuries like severs, like osgoods, like the one that happens up near your buttocks that has to do with the hamstring tendon and the bone it blends into. Generally, those growth-related injuries occur during growth phases. And during growth phases, when the loads are too much, more than the body can handle during that growth phase, you get the development of something like osgoods. And if you guys aren't familiar with what these growth-related injuries are, I can go into detail about it. But these growth-related injuries generally manifest at that time. The growth plates are never completely fused until you're skeletally mature, which can happen anywhere from 15 to 19 years of age. But when they do spike is when someone's loading is greater than the capacity during the growth phase. So a very simple thing you can do, and it's something I've been sharing with coaches locally here in Ontario and with our national team coaches whenever I get the chance, is actively measure the height of your gymnasts every 2 weeks, especially if they've not skeletally matured yet. And if you notice a 2 centimeter or around a 2 centimeter growth, assume they're in a growth phase. And if they are in a growth phase, you're better off either keeping their training volume plateaued, not increasing the intensity, not increasing the volumes, not introducing new skills, or even having a slight dip in volume. And a dip may be normally you're training, 2 hours on beam. Well, now, we're going to do an hour and 30 minutes on beam. Normally we do 40 turns on bars, doing, a release move. Now this week, we're only going to do 30 turns of this particular release move. I think someone asked a question, and if, Leanne, if it was asked on a group level, do you mind letting me know what the question is?
I sure can. So question, how does a coach monitor when enough adaptation has taken place that the increased load is the new normal? Is it in an amount of time or something has been done, or successful completion ratio? How can we tell?
That's a really good question. Physiologically, generally it takes 4 to 6 weeks for adaptation within tissues. That doesn't mean you have to take 4 to 6 weeks. A rough guideline, and we'll talk about it in a moment, is in the past, a rough guideline was 10%, the 10% rule. Don't increase volume or intensity by more than 10% weekly. Now, keep in mind that guideline was originally created amongst endurance athletes, and because it was really easy to assess volume of training. If, for example, if it was an endurance runner, you knew if in a week they ran 50 kilometers, 10% of that, they're not going to increase more than 10% of that the next week. It was really easily measurable. In other sports, it doesn't always translate to 10%, but that's not a bad guideline to follow, with some exceptions that we'll talk about. So generally, try not to jump every week to week by more than 10%. And if you do introduce a new exercise, so this is another aside from what I noticed when I first was going into clubs locally here in Ontario, when I first got involved in gymnastics, is sometimes you'll learn a really cool new exercise or a strengthening thing to do. And this was done, actually, I introduced, which I'll share with you guys next week, for those of you who are on the webinar then, an approach to improve someone's range of motion and active flexibility. Well, when I shared it with our women's national team, and some of the coaches and some of the athletes and some of the therapists went ahead and implemented it. But they implemented it because it was new and it's exciting, and the volumes that it was introduced at ended up leading to harm, ended up leading to minor injuries. So I saw this in gym clubs when I first was getting involved, is you would learn a new exercise, maybe a new approach, maybe you took a coaching course and you learned something new, and then right away you introduced it, and then right away you start to build and build and build really quickly. That doesn't provide adequate adaptation for tissues. So if you are introducing something new, keep it in there for a week, 2 weeks. It doesn't hurt, to allow the tissues to adapt before you start to really try to increase the frequency of it or the intensity of it. But a really rough guideline is that 10% rule. Try not to increase intensity by 10% or volume by 10%. And it's a lot easier to measure volume than it is to measure intensity, but that's a rough guideline to follow.
There was one more question as part of that. 2 centimeters over what period of time for the growing phase?
2 weeks. So generally, if you're measuring your athlete's height on every 2 weeks, if you notice around 2 centimeters, it could be 1.8, it could be 2.2, obviously, around 2 centimeters, assume they're going through some growth. It may not be their major growth, but it's some growth. And typically, obviously, the more we're exposed to certain nutrients and restful states, like in the summertime when kids can sleep a little bit more, get more sunshine, you're more likely to see more of the growth happening there, which is kind of tough because that's also when they're learning new skills and where their external load is changing as well. But generally speaking, it's 2 centimeters every 2 weeks. Okay, so I assume that's at the end of the questions. Okay, so that's a good guideline to follow with regards to growth phases. The other thing is another measure, key thing that contributes to internal load is sleep. And I want you to just, for yourself, guess how many hours of sleep an adolescent athlete requires. I'm just going to give you a second to think about it. And if recovery, I don't know of an adolescent athlete getting 9 to 10 hours of sleep. So that obviously is something that as practitioners, as coaches, we have to keep in mind, because if they're walking into the gym with 6 hours of sleep, 2, 3, 4, 5 days in a row, which most athletes are during the school year, their body, their body's ability to handle loads, external load, is reduced throughout the week because their internal load has increased. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. And sometimes less can be more in these kind of cases. When someone has really high internal loads, sometimes less external load can actually produce greater results, which I'll get into a little bit more. Another internal load is training environment, and that includes you as a coach. If all of a sudden you have a new equipment in the gym, that's some change to the environment for the athlete. That's something for the body. It seems really minor, but it's something for the body to adapt to tolerate in terms of its visual system and its touch and perception. All these things alter the internal or change the internal load. Some people respond favorably and some people respond not so favorably. So that's something to keep in mind. If an athlete gets stressed out when their parent is around watching them doing gymnastics, that's going to increase their internal load. There's a stressor that's called their parent that's always watching them. If an athlete if you as a coach in a particular kind of way that doesn't mesh with the athlete, maybe, I'm pretty straight, and so sometimes people can think I'm abrasive. My abrasiveness is not going to work with all athletes because that can trigger too much stress in that athlete, spiking their internal load. These all encompass someone's training environment and can also alter internal load. I've seen this a lot in gyms, and I've seen this a lot when I was involved with minor hockey. If someone's capacity to tolerate the stress from their coach and their failure on a given skill or apparatus, if they can't deal with that, it doesn't matter what you do as a coach, they're bound to fail. Because their internal loads are spiking too much, it's actually going to affect performance. So sometimes it's good to just say, okay, let's just wrap it up today. We're going to leave it be. No need for us to do any more. It's okay. You'll get it tomorrow. The thing to understand is you don't lose training capacity in a single day. What I mean by that is the strength and the capacity to do a particular skill one day is available for that person to do it the next day if they've developed properly. So if the next day they're not hitting it, there's no concern to push and push and push and push increasing the stress within the athlete and increasing the external load out of a fear that they're going to lose something, because they're not going to lose it. It's physiologically impossible to lose that in a matter of a day or two or a week even. It's much better to create a better environment so that the next day they come in and they're not fatigued out, and then they can perform what they need to do with much higher efficiency. And the last thing is relationship to oneself. We all have an internal dialogue. We all have a monkey mind in our heads. And most often, for some individuals, like I'm a highly self-critical person. I'm quite critical of myself. And as an athlete, when I was an athlete, it was hard being me and being in athletics, because if I failed even to the smallest of degrees, that small degree in my head was huge. And so when you have athletes like that, you need to know that their internal loads are much higher than another athlete who maybe doesn't have as much negative self-talk in their head. So we then cannot give the same external load to that kind of individual or have as much spike of an acute increase in loads, because they just don't have they may not at this current time have the capacity to handle it. And this is where creating a team around you is really important, because you can have people address the nutrition side, address the mental side, address, you know, the physical side of things with a strength coach. That's where the team aspect comes in really good. So here's some steps to guide you as a coach to try to manage loads. First and foremost, avoid training spikes as often as possible. There's nothing wrong if every once in a while you say, they walk into the gym and you want to push and give some stress for them to adapt to. There's nothing wrong with that. You just got to read your audience. Some athletes are not going to take that really well. The internal load, the stress internally within them is going to spike, and it's actually not going to be favorable for them for performance. It may not even lead to injury, but for performance. But there's nothing wrong. But if that's being done on a regular basis or a semi-regular basis, that's a recipe for disaster. You're gonna limit their ability to increase performance. And absolutely contribute to the potential rate of injury. So try to avoid training spikes. That 10% rule is a rough guideline that you can follow. Do know that some athletes will be able to handle more and some will require less than 10%. And so this is, I guess this graph will show you what I mean. If someone's capacity is quite low, let's say someone is just coming back from an injury, well, they're going to be able to increase 10% every week, no problem, because their ceiling is a lot higher. They're starting down here, their ceiling's a lot higher. But if someone is already up here, you can't increase them 10% every week. It's just not going to be possible, because they're going to hit their ceiling. So that's where you got to know your also that 10% isn't going to always apply consistently all the time. Maybe in that athlete who's been consistently training throughout the year without any time off, maybe with them, their percent increase is 0.5 from week to week. Maybe it's 1%. Maybe I'm only going to spike them one day and then give them a day off, so their overall load for the whole week hasn't fluctuated too much. So that's something else to consider, that this 10% rule is a guideline and it varies from athlete to athlete. So this generally just goes over some of the things I was just saying right now. Is you do want exposure to loads. You do want the system to be stressed and to be adapted. You just want that to be done in the most appropriate way. Because those who don't have a really high chronic workload ratio actually risk getting increased injuries, because once they are put in a position to perform, the demands put on their body and the internal load that's increased, because of the demand of the competition, lends their body unable to handle it, the capacity of a competition setting. So you do want the chronic workload ratio to be high and gradually increase through the year. You just want that acute burst to be minimized. as much as possible. And then with the exception of just keeping in mind that 2 centimeter rule with people who are adolescent or athletes who are adolescent who are still growing. Because in those athletes, you don't want to, sometimes what it will require you is to actually train, and then dip down in your training while they're going through their growth spurt to reduce the risk of an injury. And I know sometimes as a coach, that could be quite threatening, the idea of actually taking a step back in training. So I want to share with you an anecdote. I was one of the strength coaches that worked with a lot of the women's hockey team that went to in 2006, I went to Torino. And what we did with them in the off season, they have 2 months of an off season, and usually they'll work out 4 to 5 months. What we did with them is that one summer is we said, you're only doing great workouts twice a week instead of the 4 or 5 they usually do. And then we said every 3rd week, you're actually going to reduce your volume and intensity. So what that meant is if normally they squatted and did like a clean of 200 pounds 5 times for 3 sets, after 2 weeks, that 3rd week, they only did 2 sets. And instead of 5 reps, they did 4 reps. And instead of 200 pounds, they did 150 pounds. And that was quite challenging at first for the athletes to take in, because in their heads are like, hold on a second, I only have 2 months and you've now taken my training and cut it in half. So I'm not working out 4 days a week, I'm doing it twice a week. And on top of that, every 3rd week, I'm supposed to cut down. So it was hard for them to tolerate, but sometimes less is more. When you can properly ascertain the loading and manage the loads really well, you're actually going to get a spike in performance, which they had. Every time they came back from this sort of down recovery week where their loads and intensity dropped, they had increased output. Their squats went up, their cleans went up, their bench presses went up. So sometimes less is more. Don't be too afraid of taking a step back sometimes, especially when you're dealing with someone who has high internal loads, like in this case, someone going through a growth spurt, and they're in that sort of 2% rule, 2 centimeter rule, where we want them to actually reduce load to reduce the risk of a growth plate injury.
Mahmoud, we have a question.
Yeah.
Sometimes it becomes very difficult to increase load by only 10%. For example, when building up routine fitness, adding 1 skill at a time would be about 10% increase. If we did this weekly, it would take up over 10 weeks to build up adequately to a full routine. What are your thoughts on this?
You're right. So this is what I was saying about the 10%. If someone's ceiling is down here, I mean, if someone's starting down here and their ceiling is up here, you can afford 10%. In some cases, you may be able to afford more than 10%. So that's generally a guideline. What I would say, though, is if a really good amount of time is done to build up strength, the basic foundational things, strength, flexibility, active flexibility in particular, if these basic things are built up, the higher spikes that someone can handle. And if they're generally young, they could handle more spikes, higher spikes for a longer period of time. So you don't have to necessarily follow 10%. If a gymnast just comes to you and you need them to learn skills, obviously you can do a lot quicker. I have a niece who just started gymnastics, and she's picking things up every week. Her body adapts, picks it up really quickly. Her tissues can handle this stuff, so it's not a problem. You'll know when it's too much because they'll start to plateau. Their ability to retain the skill that you're teaching them and to execute it consistently and have the stamina or the strength be maintained starts to plateau. And that's generally a sign, okay, maybe I need to dial down how much I'm increasing things. So that is a good question, and that's more, the 10% rule is generally a guideline, and is dependent on where the athlete is at, and specifically what it is that you're adding. If the skill is simply, I just want you to do, a tumbling line on beam that you've already done on floor 30 times, asking them to do it 5 more times on beam is not going to be make it or break it. So let's say they do it 30 times on floor, and they normally do it 10 times on beam. Now I'm asking them to do 5 times more on beam. Yes, on beam, that 5 new numbers translates to a 50% increase, which is too much. But if it's a similar tumbling line that's done on floors, that 5 increase is actually out of 60 because they already do 50 on floor. So 5 out of 60, that's less than that 10%. So you have to be someone, look at what you're giving them and see how is that in relationship to other things that they're already doing. And sometimes it's hard. Like I have coaches here in Ontario who come to me and say, listen, here's what I want to do with my gymnasts. Now I think it'll be okay, but given what they're already doing in the program, do you see this being too much? And so if there's ever uncertainty on your end, this is where it pays to actually work with someone who understands this and who has maybe a different sort of field of expertise to reassure you or guide you in your concerns. So I hope that answers that question. If it doesn't, please let me know.
Yeah, I think we're good on that one.
Okay. And so the other thing that I would suggest is group your athletes. I know right now we are grouping athletes. We generally group them by levels, but if you can, within the levels, or even separate from the levels, try to group them based on what their bodies can tolerate. And it'll make coaching, I think, a little bit easier for you. You're gonna have those group of individuals that are just robust, and they can handle spikes, they can handle a lot of things. I was one of those athletes where if one week they said to me, okay, Mahmoud, now we're gonna spike you up like this, I tolerated it and I dealt with it and I can do it really well. My best friend, when I played a collegiate football, my best friend did it. He wasn't in the same boat. We were both great athletes. We were both all-stars when we played. We both did really well, but when it came to training, how we handled training was different. So individuals' bodies are different. So if you notice and can recognize, okay, I have these robust athletes that can tolerate spikes better, that it can tolerate increases or higher intensities and everything, group them together and have them do a different training than the individuals who aren't in that group. And then maybe you can group sort of the in-betweeners that aren't quite fragile but aren't quite robust, and group them together and create their training based on that. And that way you'll always be able to police them. Whereas if you have a group that has robust athletes, in-betweeners, and fragile, like I've sort of distinguished them here, it makes it really tough to progress as a group because you have so many different individuals with different levels that they can tolerate. So you may want to start to group in athletes, if you're coaching a group of athletes together, and group them based on what their bodies can tolerate. And I think you can intuitively guess who are the robust ones, who are the fragile ones, who are the in-between ones. The other thing I would suggest is don't be hesitant to sort of create these undulating programs. And so typical periodization is you start down here and you gradually build up to up here, which would be your competition. In a perfect world, that makes sense. That'd be easy to do. But we don't live in a perfect world, and athletes will get injured, things change. We have something like this that goes on that we can't be in the gym for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 days. Power goes out in the gym, we can't train that day. So there's variables that are thrown at us. So if creating an undulating program allows you to manage those variables and allows you to manage the loads pretty well. And essentially an undulating program is, okay, we're gonna have 1 week like this, and then the next week we're gonna drop it down here. And then the next week we'll go up here, and then we'll drop it down here. And then the next week we'll come up here, and then we'll come back down here. Which is essentially what we did with the women's hockey team, is we undulated the program. We had intensity levels that altered from week to week. And just because 1 week they were peaking, we weren't afraid to say, okay, this next week we're gonna dial it down. Your volume's gonna drop, because we knew and we were confident that there will be a super composition that will come back the other way, where the athletes will then come back after that little bit of recovery with greater gains. So creating an undulation in the program design within the week, within a period of weeks, would also really benefit to help manage and maintain a healthy chronic to acute workload. And I think a question came in, so I'll just stop.
It was just a thank you. One of our attendees has to leave her meeting, so wanted to thank you for your time.
Okay, no problem. So sometimes you just need to ditch your plan. Maybe that day as a coach, you had a plan that you wanted your athlete to do this, but if they come in and you can tell they haven't slept well for 3 or 4 days, they're stressed about a midterm they just did, whatever, even this is where if you increase the external load by 10% or 5%, if their internal load is so high, they may just not be able to tolerate that 5% increase. So sometimes you got to be willing to ditch the plan, read the signs, and maybe say, okay, you know what? Don't worry about it today. We're going to dial it down. There's one of the coaches at a club here and took this on because I shared with them this particular idea. And, you know, sometimes athletes will come in and they're stressed. You can tell they're anxious. Their head's all over the place. It's not, they're not on training. And so she said, okay, you know what? Training's done. At the 2-hour mark, said training's done. Don't worry about it. We had worked on implementing some meditation relaxation programs with them. So I said, okay, take the next 30 minutes. I want you to go through your conditioning, take 30 minutes to do some stretching, and take 30 minutes to go through some meditation relaxation exercises. Now, you may think I'm compromising 2 to 3 hours of training with that individual, but what you're actually doing is giving something that's going to nourish their body and replenish and recover them much better. So the next day or the next time they're at it, they can actually perform higher than they were before. And I've mentioned this before, I think the more you can implement a team approach, create a team around you, have a really good nutritionist, have a really good mental performance coach, have a really good strength coach, have a really good therapist, because they can help guide you in what's appropriate loading and what's not, and for each individual athlete. This is just an example of a general, you know, periodized program where it sort of peaks in volume and intensity, sort of alter to peak at a major competition, and then below, that's what I was saying in terms of the undulating, which sort of changes and alters over a period of time. I'm going to put this back on. The other thing, actually, a question came in, so I'll let that question be asked.
That was me again. I was just putting a message out to, oh, hold on. No, there is one. What is the indefinite period of time out of the gym? Oh, hold on. With this indefinite period of time out of the gym means we must be extremely careful on our return to training plans. It is also extremely important that the athlete try to stay fit while we wait for permission to get back into the gym. Where can we look for guidance with a plan for return to play plan? I get the 10% increase, but what about a starting point? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense, and that's a good question, and those are good considerations, because these are the things that you want to consider. At a very basic level, you know, the calluses that were formed on the hands, they're going to be gone by the time they're back in the gyms. So their hands can't tolerate the repetition on bars quite the same way they did before. So this is it's a unique period, and it's a unique situation, because we actually don't know the negative implications of being off 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months from gym, and then being asked to go back. So my recommendation would be is go to the basics, you know, and in terms of basics, in terms of strengthening, basics in terms of gym related stuff, and build up. And I would probably spend the first, you know, hopefully if they use their time really well, they build and they maintain really good active ranges of motion and build up really good capacities. I think I think this was forwarded out anyways. I put together for a bunch of gymnastics training videos to try to maintain joint health and joint ranges of motion and strength in the gymnastics ranges that they need. So hopefully they're doing a lot of that stuff leading up to when they return to gym. But when they return to gym, I would just spend the first month on the basic of building basic strength, like a squat and a lunge, if they're not doing it already right now. Basic gymnastics skills and strength stuff. And you'll know after, you know, 2 weeks how much you can start to increase each athlete. I wouldn't judge it based on a workout or a week's workout, because there's going to be a lot of good hormones and adrenaline and feel goodness to being back at the gym and doing things that can they'll handle for 1 workout, 2 workouts, 4 workouts, 5 trainings, but in a whole week. But by the second week, the central nervous system has been spiked way too much because they've got this large stimulus of training that they'll start to actually have that second week a drop in performance. And so if you want to avoid that, then I would just say, especially the first month, take it slow, and roughly around 2 weeks, you'll get a sense of when you can, how much you can start to push up. Is there another question?
Yeah, okay. Musculoskeletal adaptations are much faster than myotendinitis and joint adaptations, about 2 times faster. And this should be taken into account when we are planning. What would be the best way to control intensity and volume? Check the quantity of elements during a daily session, during the week, during the month. And how would you evaluate the execution of a simple skill in comparison to a skill that is extremely difficult and stressful? Hopefully that works.
Yes. So I think I handed out a handout. And what I tried to do was create a graph. And I'm going to try to pull it up here. Give me 1 second so I can. Can you guys all see this? What's on my screen?
It's still the graphs from the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
The last slide.
Oh, can you see this?
Same thing.
Oh, okay. Oh, here. How about, oh, it doesn't let me do that. Oh, that's a shame. Okay. Did you guys get that handout that was the Excel spreadsheet?
I did distribute it through email, but if they didn't receive it, just send me an email to coaching@gmbc.org and I'd be happy to forward it over.
Okay, perfect. So on that, you can't see, you still see the graphs on your screen?
Yes, still the graphs.
Okay. Anyways, if you have it in front of you, if you look, I've tried to create the WU is the warm up. There's the vault. There's uneven bars. There's beam. There's floor, and then there's whatever you would do in terms of conditioning. So you can that shows what they do each in total. Now the number that comes up with is in the daily load. So if you look in the daily load, you have, let's say, something like vault, and then you have RPEs, which is rate of perceived exertion. And this is what the athlete says. How intense was it for them to do? And they'll score that out of 10. You can write down the time of how long it took them at that event. So let's say it's 20 minutes. And then you can weight it from like 1 to 4, let's say, of how hard it is what they're doing. So if it's easy, if it's medium, if it's hard, if it's very hard. And then you multiply all that number, that gives you roughly a load that they're handling, this sort of fictitious unit of measure that we're making up to let you know what the load is. That'll let you measure what their load is on a daily basis, so you can measure sort of progress. And you could look at it and see, okay, you know what, when you have the daily numbers put in there, and then you put it into the weekly load, you can see throughout the week how, let's say, vault is changing and progressing, or uneven bars is changing and progressing in terms of the loads that you're giving them, so you can modulate things. So I put that together to help you manage the loads, generally in season, but especially when you're going back in. As far as your question is, okay, how can we protect ourselves against injuries to do with the muscular tendinous tissues and for example, like growth plates in adolescent athletes, in those cases, this is why I would just stick to like the basic of building strength. If you build strength in your muscles and you build strength in your tendons, you reduce the risk of doing something powerfully and explosive and causing trauma to the tendon or the growth plate. So again, hopefully, like what gymnasts could be doing right now is doing those strength training stuff, non-traditional gymnastic stuff, like squatting, like lunging. I know it's hard because everyone's at home, there's minimal things, but when they come back in the gym, if you just spent the first 2-3 weeks just doing that, I know it's, and incorporating some basic gymnastic stuff, like easy series on beam or easy leaps or easy tumbling lines, or just not even tumbling lines initially. Maybe we just get them to do some plyometric stuff, easy things like that. You'll build the appropriate strength. And like I said, it takes 4 to 6 weeks generally for physical adaptation to take place. But that's not to say we need to wait 6 weeks. If we do them as we get close to that 4-week mark, we can start to then implement and increase intensities. That would be your best measure. And I know that may put you behind a month because you're like, oh man, I'm losing another month to prepare my athlete with regards to gymnastics related things. But that's how you try to protect them and just make sure they're always going like this. They're never hitting a plateau, which is what we did with the women's hockey team. They increased like this throughout the whole summer. There was never a point of plateau that they hit because of how we modulated. So I think that's how I would answer that question. Hopefully that answers it for you. If it doesn't, please let me know.
Okay, we've got another question here. Going back to growth phase, I am not familiar with the soft tissue injury in the flute hamstring area. An athlete I had possibly had that. How can you treat that in the future?
Any growth plate related injuries. So whether it's Osgood, whether it's Severs, whether it's Sinding Larson's, whether that's this one that happens where the hamstring tendon is, the very first and primary thing you need to do is deload. They need to reduce activity to stop irritation because there's an active inflammatory process and irritation that's going on. They just need to stop that. And then in terms of what they need to do, it all depends on the therapist that you have available to you and the skill sets and the tools that they have available to you. So like what I would do with an athlete treating that is going to maybe be different than from another therapist based on the tools that we have available to us. But initially you need to deload to an appropriate period of time, and that varies for each. They may, for a period of time, need to avoid, like in the case of the hamstring one, split leaps or stretching, middle splits, front splits, because that's going to irritate the growth plate. So that's generally the rule of thumb that you follow, and how long it takes varies. I had an athlete this past year who had that injury, and within 4 weeks, she returned to full gymnastics, which is probably the fastest I've ever gotten someone back to gymnastics. I also had another athlete who had dealt with it for 6 months. So that is person dependent, body dependent, individual dependent. So but generally the initial step is you deload. You eliminate loading of the tissue and or ranges that aggravate it.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming through. I just wanted to give you a minute, Mahmoud, to possibly bring up what you're talking about next Friday so we can mention it to the coaches that are on the call right now.
Okay, sure. Before I do that, I will do that. If you can give me one more second, just with the internal loads, I also created a graph for you guys to actually track what someone's internal load will be like. So if you have that sheet in front of you, you can ask your gymnast to fill in how many hours of sleep they had, how fatigued they feel coming into training, how sore they feel coming into training from a 1 to 10 scale, and then what their resting heart rate is. Resting heart rate is one of the physical measures that we have to get a sense of what someone's internal load is like. So if you get someone who's had 6 hours of sleep, their fatigue coming into training is at a 7, they're sore at around an 8, and their resting heart rate is like 104, their internal loads are too high. So for that particular athlete that day, you just may not want to push them too much with the external demands. Okay, so as far as next week, so one of the other things, like I said, that I was really passionate about when I got involved with gymnastics is sharing with them tools and approaches and specifically ideologies that to improve gymnastic capacity. And so gymnastics is a unique sport in that there's a very small number of sports that require you to be very strong in really end range positions. And unfortunately, what I came to realize is that's not being, those particular, the approaches needed to strengthen in those end ranges are not being done in gymnastics and have never been done. So that's not to say that some gymnasts don't get strong in those end ranges. They do, but that becomes variable and based on the individual athleticism of that athlete. So what the talk next week is about is teaching you and sharing with you about the difference between flexibility and active flexibility, what it means and how you go about training at these sort of at the edges of ranges of motion, which is the the areas of strength that gymnasts require more than anything because of the ranges of motion, the wide ranges of motion that they're required to go through. And talk about one of the ways you could increase capacity so that a gymnast could handle loads without getting injury. Because if you remember, injuries are very simple. The load is more than the individual's capacity. So this discussion next week will address on one of the key ways you can increase capacity for a gymnast to handle more loads.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So yeah, I think John just wanted to say a quick thank you before we wrap up here today.
Sure.
Yeah, Mahmoud, I just on behalf of all the coaches that are online, it was great. It was a great presentation. We really appreciate your time and effort. We had some technical difficulties, as all of you online know. We actually thought we only had about 4 people registered up until about 3 hours ago. And to have 75 people on this Zoom session was absolutely amazing. I know Leanne wanted me to mention that we have 3 more sessions, webinars already planned for next week, and they're up on our calendar for registration. And also, just a call out to all you coaches, if there's anything that you really have a burning desire to learn about, send me an email, send Leanne an email, let us know what it is, and we'll see if we can find something or someone to talk about it over the next month, I guess. So I think we're in this boat for a little while, so we might as well learn as much as we can. Mahmoud, you are absolutely amazing, and I'm looking forward to next week's session for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. I just want to say, out of all the provinces, BC has like the greatest commitment to development within the community of gymnastics. So I've noticed this because obviously I've connected with different provinces. So this is a kudos to BC, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of that community for today.
Super. We've got that recorded, right, Leanne?
Yeah, we sure do. That is the only clip that's going to end up on our website.
Thanks again, Mahmoud.